will now turn to Professor Ad de Bruijne. De Bruijne is Professor of Ethics and Spirituality at Theological University here in Kampen. Last year he had a sabbatical in which he went to the United States, and he there renewed his acquaintance with Stanley Hauerwas also. In his own theological position, de Bruijne is both indebted to Hauerwas' theology and curious about certain features of it. Let us hear what he has to say on Hauerwas here in Holland.
Thank you, Hans. 4 years ago, Dutch ethicist Peter Dronkers coined the expression a Kuperian Hauerwas. He referred to the recent attention to Stanley Hauerwas among Dutch Christians from the Reformed or New Calvinist tradition. According to Dronkers, they have created a Hauerwas after their own image, a Kuperian Hauerwas. In my contribution today, I would like to examine to what extent Dronkers' analysis is true, and whether such a Kuperian Hauerwas would be possible. The fascination with Hauerwas in Dutch Reformed circles developed relatively late. Already since the 80s, Stanley Hauerwas has been an iconic theological ethicist. However, in the Netherlands, only a few theologians interacted with his work. The first was the ethicist Hans Reinders. His congeniality with Hauerwas fits his own shift from a liberal theological position to a post-liberal stance. Reinders I consider to be still the foremost, only perhaps Dutch ethicist whose approach is really compatible with Hauerwas. In the 90s, also Frits de Lange corrected an inherited liberal approach by means of a Hauerwasian emphasis on narrative, virtue, and the church as community. Nevertheless, the distance between de Lange and Hauerwas remains substantial. De Lange wants this ecclesial community with its specific narrative and potential for identity formation to contribute to a badly needed new civil religion for post-Christian Dutch society. Precisely the American version of such a civil religion forms Hauerwas' main target of criticism and the trigger behind many of his theological accents. We can conclude that the first little wave of Dutch attention to Hauerwas was represented by liberal theologians leaving behind aspects of their liberal tradition. And this fits Hauerwas' oeuvre, since it is primarily meant to articulate an alternative to the dominant Western liberalism and the various ways churches and Christians have accommodated to this. This renders all the more intriguing the more recent attention to Hauerwas among Reformed Christians. Please allow me to recall that the roots of this attention can already be found earlier than many think. When I started teaching ethics here at Kampen University in 1997, I found there a generation of students, several of them being well versed in and strongly attracted by Hauerwas' work. Some of them are present here today. They introduced me to Hauerwas theology. If you allow me, I will use part of my own life story to clarify why Reformed New Calvinists became interested in this American theologian. Before becoming a teacher in ethics, I served as a minister in the center of Rotterdam. It was during the 90s when the process of dechristianization in Dutch society accelerated. Two experiences from those years gave my later encounter with Hauerwas' work an almost existential character. In the first place, we felt daily how non-self-evidential a Christian lifestyle had become in a post-Christian society. The prevailing Reformed ethical model, which distilled God's universal commandments from the Bible, expecting clear and generally shared conclusions on moral matters, no longer worked. Christian ethical claims turned out to be less universal than we had always believed. In hindsight, they showed themselves as having been dependent on the particular context of a Christian society. Now that such a society had vanished from the city, a committed Christian life came under great pressure. The only alternative context for Christian life that seemed to remain was the church itself. We longed for a congregation with on the one hand Christians who could be examples for others, and on the other hand Christians who would be prepared to follow examples. When reading Hauerwas, A Peaceable Kingdom, and Resident Aliens during my first year in Kampen, he offered me the very language that helped explain this Rotterdam experience and longing. Our usual Reformed divine command ethics turned out to have often been an ethics of Christendom, but Christendom was over. To prevent ourselves to fall prey to a secular lifestyle, we would need the alternative society of the kingdom as represented by the church that lives the story of the gospel and harbors specific traditions and practices to train Christian character and Christian virtue. My second Rotterdam experience concerned an impasse concerning Christian political possibilities. Dutch Reformed Christians have always been accustomed to bearing political responsibility and exercising political power. However, in the microcosm of a secularized city like Rotterdam, possibilities for that proved virtually absent. Being a marginal minority made it impossible to influence urban society along the usual political lines. Not wanting to end up with a dualism between a private Christian life in the church and a neutral stance in the public domain, we thought about how the local church itself could seek the welfare of our city. Again, after my becoming an ethicist, Hauerwas provided me to understand what we had experienced. In his After Christendom, he criticized the Constantinian ideal of a Christian state and the use of political power for Christian purposes. Instead, the church itself should be considered the new political community of the coming kingdom, which will once replace all existing political societies. She has to develop a politics of her own, not dependent on the existing politics of a society. Unlike Hauerwas, I see no reason why Christians could not, in a secondary move, try to make this politics of the church fruitful for the politics of this world. Yet I am still grateful for this new insight into the church as the primary political community. These two moments from my own life story I consider exemplary for other new Calvinists who have discovered Hauerwas. But this would only be a Cuyperian embrace of Hauerwas, not yet the Cuyperian Hauerwas himself that drunkards claim to have noticed. He even speaks of a bolder Hauerwas. I think he is right, but in order to see that, we have to move from our conscious motives behind Neo-Calvinist sympathies for Hauerwas to the more unconscious mechanisms. Could it be that Hauerwas provides young Neo-Calvinists with a way to continue their Cuyperian tradition without having to reconnect to Kuyper himself? After all, the Cuyperian tradition contains two simultaneous accents that hold each other in a peculiar tension. On the one hand, his doctrine of antithesis implies a contrast between church and world that is as pronounced as in Hauerwas. Kuyper too writes critically about the synthesis of church and state and church and culture since Constantine. His main opponents were those who advocated a national church or a watered-down Christian civil religion. Just like Hauerwas, Kuyper's work contains flirtations with Anabaptists. But this antithesis is balanced by Kuyper's doctrine of common grace, which enables him to bear Christian public responsibility without losing a genuine Christian identity. Interestingly, precisely this appears to be the way Neo-Calvinists tend to appropriate Hauerwas. On the one hand, they accept his ecclesiology with the concept of the church as a contrast society, but on the other they aspire to use precisely such a church as a platform to constructively participate in the public and political domains and to actively seek a better world here and now. Hauerwas leads a new generation of Reformed Christians back home in their own tradition, albeit without their noticing it. Could such an appropriation of Hauerwas be justified from his work? My first intuition will be hesitant, since here one of the defining characteristics of Hauerwas' theology remains out of sight, namely his advocacy of, non-violence, which is directly connected to his vision of God. Here difference with the Reformed tradition remains unbridgeable, since accepting Christian public or political responsibility inevitably will lead to bearing responsibility for acts of violence. A second important reservation with the Kuyperian Hauerwas consists of his narrative way of doing theology and ethics as opposed to the Reformed foundationalist commandment model. But already here some promising perspective arises. For Hauerwas himself has stated that he does not want to deny the role of commandments in ethics, if only located within the context of Christian narrative and character. And Kuyper's peculiar distinction between Christian normalists and secular abnormalists, who will unavoidably develop into diverging directions, could in fact be easily reformulated as referring to two mutually exclusive narratives. It is not coincidental that already in 1990, the new Calvinist ethicist Richard Mouw developed the concept of worldview and divine commandments that connects to categories such as narrative and character, which he derived from his interaction with Hauerwas. Despite the important difference concerning non-violence and the different style of doing theology, I see indeed some remarkable potential for convergence. But we will only recognize these when we both nuance all too quick interpretations of Hauerwas and liberate the real Kuyper from what successors and supporters have made of him. Both Kuyper and Hauerwas seem to have used their later works to either shift accents or clear up some misunderstandings. 4 examples will illustrate this. First, in Hauerwas' book, With the Grain of the Universe, he confesses the importance of creation and acknowledges the good and valuable outside the church. Although he refers to Barth and not to common grace, this could still ease an often articulated tension between the Reformed emphasis on creation and Hauerwas' eschatological approach. This is all the more true since also Kuyper tries to interpret common grace from Christology. We should not judge him as if he should have interacted with Karl Barth already. When seen in his own context, he proves to move away from an all too simplistic creational model. Secondly, Hauerwas' new preface to After Christendom should once and for all end the misinterpretation that he advocates an apolitical Christian withdrawal from the world, thereby representing a Troeltschen sect type or a Niebuhrian Christ against culture stance. Only those who oppose the vision that the church is a political society of its own will make such judgments. Instead, Hauerwas aspires for Christian public presence and activity, but within the context of the church and with the wisdom of the kingdom, and not from a foreign liberal stance. In much the same manner, Kuyper does not fit such categories either, although he is usually championed as a Christ transforming culture theologian. Kuyper's project too comes down to developing a Christian public stance from the context of a now independent church which is only accountable to its Lord. He even reckoned with approaching times where Christians would be left no other choice than, as Hauerwas would phrase it, to survive in the context of the church in a world which we thought to be ours. Thirdly, in his Christianity, Democracy and the Radical Ordinary, I see Hauerwas moving towards an important distinction between democracy and liberalism. This enables him to speak more favorably about democracy while remaining critical as ever towards liberalism. In his 19th century context, Kuyper has made a comparable move when contending democracy to be the heritage of Calvinism rather than liberalism. With his specific Christian concept of democracy, Kuyper stimulated the more Anabaptist Reformed substreams in his days to become actively involved in their society. Who will predict what could be the potential of Hauerwas' own version of such a possible move? Fourthly, Hauerwas tells us that he has discovered a, quote, dirty little secret. Namely, that nothing is wrong with, quote, the ideal of a society in which all of life is integrated under the lordship of Christ. This comes remarkably close, even in its phrasing, to the famous Cooperian no square inch saying. Of course, Hauerwas proceeds to explain that the real problem has been that Christians have forgotten this to be an eschatological reality, so that they try to realize this ideal within the present world. But even here, Kuyper approaches him as a matter of fact, and contrary to many interpretations of his work, he never equates results of Christian public action with this unified society of Christ's kingdom. When growing older, he deliberately pursued eschatological lines of thought. The possibility of interaction between both is confirmed by Hauerwas' discussion with James Davison Hunter in his well-known book To Change This World, as I interpret Hunter as advocating a position which resembles the older Kuyper. Both Hauerwas and Hunter accept Jeremiah's letter to the exiles in Babylon as paradigm. Christians live in exile and have yet to seek the welfare of their societies. They are indeed resident aliens. The remaining difference boils down to one of accent. Hauerwas emphasizes Christians being aliens and Hunter them being resident. So, would a Cooperian Hauerwas be a viable option? Well, to a certain extent, and on one decisive condition. A Cooperian Hauerwas requires the rediscovery of a Hauerwasian Kuyper.